The telegram sat on Franklin Roosevelt's desk for 3 minutes before he opened it. His hands didn't shake. They never did. But his assistant noticed he read it twice before setting it down. The date was June 13th, 1940. France had 6 days left. If you've ever wondered how close Britain came to surrendering in 1940, stay until the end of this story. What you're about to hear has never been told this way before. William Bullitt wasn't supposed to be the most important American in Europe. He was the US ambassador to France, a position that typically involved dinner parties and diplomatic courtesy. But on May 10th, 1940, when German tanks crossed into Belgium and began their systematic dismantling of the French army, Bullitt became something else entirely. He became Roosevelt's eyes and ears for the collapse of Western civilization. The speed was what broke everyone's mind. Not the defeat itself, but the velocity of it. The French army wasn't small. It had more tanks than Germany. It had the Maginot Line, that concrete monster of fortifications that was supposed to make invasion impossible. It had Britain fighting alongside it. On paper, the math worked. In reality, the math was irrelevant. Bullitt sent his first alarmed cable on May 15th. The Germans had broken through at Sedan. French General Maurice Gamelin, the man responsible for defending France, told his government he had no strategic reserve, none. The entire French military doctrine had assumed a replay of World War I, a grinding static war of trenches and attrition. Instead, German General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions simply drove around the Maginot Line, punched through the Ardennes forest that French generals said was impassable for tanks, and were now racing toward the English Channel to cut off the British army. French officials begin burning documents on May 18th. Not military plans, everything. Birth certificates, tax records, the paperwork of government itself. They were preparing for occupation before the battle was even finished. Winston Churchill flew to Paris that same day. He'd only been Prime Minister for 8 days. 8 days. Britain's previous leader, Neville Chamberlain, had resigned in disgrace after his appeasement strategy proved catastrophically wrong. Churchill inherited a disaster in motion and immediately flew into its center. Bullitt was there when Churchill arrived at the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry. The American ambassador watched the British Prime Minister walk through smoke from burning documents into a conference room where French Premier Paul Renaud sat with a face like a death mask. Churchill asked a simple question. Where is the strategic reserve? General Gamelin answered in French, Aucun, none. Bullitt later told Roosevelt that Churchill's face didn't change expression, but he lit a cigar with hands that took 2 attempts to steady the match. The room smelled like burning paper and tobacco. Outside the windows, Parisians were loading cars with whatever they could carry. The roads south were already clogging with refugees. Here's what nobody understood yet, what Bullitt was just beginning to grasp. France wasn't losing a battle. France was ceasing to exist as a military power in real time. The German advance was moving so fast that French units were receiving orders to defend positions they'd already retreated from. Communication networks were collapsing. Supply lines were phantoms. Officers were making decisions based on rumors. Because the official situation reports were 6 hours behind reality, Bullitt sent Roosevelt a cable that night with a sentence that would prove prophetic. The French are beaten. They know they're beaten. The only question now is whether Britain fights on alone. On May 20th, German tanks reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They'd crossed France in 10 days. The British Expeditionary Force, nearly 400,000 men, was now trapped in a pocket around the port city of Dunkirk. Churchill ordered evacuation. Operation Dynamo began on May 26th. Every ship Britain could muster, from destroyers to fishing boats, crossed the Channel to pull soldiers off the beaches while the Luftwaffe bombed them, and German artillery fired from the perimeter. Bullitt drove to the coast to see it himself. He stood on a hill overlooking the sea and watched the smoke rising from Dunkirk 60 miles away. French soldiers asked him when American troops were coming. He had no answer. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but Congress was overwhelmingly isolationist. America's army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The United States wasn't ready for this war. It might never be ready. The evacuation at Dunkirk pulled off a miracle. By June 4th, they'd rescued 338,000 soldiers. Churchill gave his famous speech, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Stirring words. But Bullitt knew what Churchill didn't say out loud. Britain had abandoned most of its heavy equipment in France. Tanks, artillery, trucks, all of it left behind. The British army was saved, but it was no longer an army capable of fighting Germany on equal terms. France had 2 weeks left. Maybe less. Paul Reynaud, the French premier, was fighting a losing battle inside his own government. Half his cabinet wanted to ask Germany for armistice terms. The other half wanted to continue fighting from North Africa. Reynaud himself was torn, exhausted, and increasingly alone. His mistress, Helene de Portes, was openly advocating for surrender and had more influence over him than his own ministers realized. Bullitt met with Reynaud on June 10th. Italy had just declared war on France. Mussolini opportunistically jumping in to grab territory from an opponent too weak to resist. Reynaud looked like he'd aged a decade in 4 weeks. He told Bullitt he was going to resign. The French government would leave Paris, maybe move to Bordeaux, maybe flee to North Africa. Nobody seemed certain of anything except that Paris would fall. The French government declared Paris an open city on June 11th, meaning they wouldn't defend it to spare the population and architecture from destruction. German troops would march into the capital of France without firing a shot. The city that had stood unconquered since 1871 would simply be handed over. Bullitt made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He stayed. Roosevelt had ordered all American diplomats to evacuate with the French government, but Bullitt refused. He was the U.S. ambassador to France, and France's capital was Paris. He would remain at his post. He sent Roosevelt a cable explaining his reasoning, then burned his codes so the Germans couldn't capture them. He was now the only Allied ambassador left in Paris, waiting for occupation. German advance units entered Paris on June 14th at 5:30 in the morning. Bullitt watched from the embassy. The streets were nearly empty. 2 million Parisians had fled south. Those who remained stayed indoors. The Germans marched in formation down the Champs-Élysées, their boots echoing off buildings in the unnatural silence. Swastika flags went up on the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. The City of Light became a German possession before noon. Bullitt met with the German military commandant that afternoon, establishing protocols for the embassy's protection. It was surreal, cordial, professional. The Germans were disciplined, correct, almost courteous. They were conquerors behaving like administrators. Bullitt sent a message to Roosevelt through the still-functioning U.S. consulate in Lyon. Paris has fallen. The French army has disintegrated. Britain stands alone. Germany has won the war in the West, except Britain hadn't surrendered. Churchill hadn't even considered it, and that's where this story pivots into something nobody expected. On June 16th, the French government in Bordeaux voted to seek armistice terms from Germany. Paul Reynaud resigned. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of World War I, became premier with the explicit mandate to end the war. France was finished fighting. Britain had no allies left on the European continent. Hitler controlled everything from the English Channel to the Polish border. Churchill flew to France, one last time on June 13th, before Reynaud's resignation, for a final desperate meeting. He brought an offer so radical, so unprecedented, that most historians still argue about whether he was serious. A complete union of Britain and France. One country, one government, one military. British and French citizens would have the same nationality, the same parliament, the same shared destiny. It was constitutional insanity. But Churchill was trying to give Reynaud political cover to continue the war from North Africa. The French cabinet rejected it. They were done. The meeting ended with Churchill and Reynaud both knowing it was over. As Churchill boarded his plane to return to Britain, Reynaud walked him to the aircraft. Bullitt, present for the farewell, later reported the last thing Churchill said to Reynaud in private, his voice barely audible over the aircraft engines. "Whatever happens, remember that England will fight on. We will never surrender, never, but we cannot do this alone." Reynaud nodded. He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. France was surrendering. Britain would face Germany alone. Churchill's plane lifted off, and Reynaud walked back to his government to resign. The armistice was signed on June 22nd in the same railway car where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918. Hitler insisted on the location deliberately, a humiliation designed to erase the shame of German defeat in World War I. France was divided into occupied and unoccupied zones. The French military was disarmed. Pétain's government in Vichy would collaborate with Germany for the next 4 years. It had taken 6 weeks to destroy the nation that had been Germany's primary adversary for centuries. Bullitt remained in Paris for 2 more weeks before the Germans forced him to leave. He spent the time documenting the occupation, meeting with French officials who stayed behind, and trying to understand what had just happened. His cables to Roosevelt during this period are remarkable for their clarity and despair. He described a nation in shock, unable to process the speed of its own defeat. French soldiers wandered Paris in confusion, still in uniform but with no army to return to. Citizens stood in lines at German checkpoints to receive permission to travel inside their own city. The restaurants and cafes remained open, serving German officers who paid in occupation currency. When Bullitt finally left Paris in July, driving south through checkpoints in occupied territory, he passed columns of French prisoners of war marching north toward Germany. Nearly 2 million French soldiers would spend the war in German captivity. The roads were still clogged with refugees trying to return home, many of them discovering their homes had been destroyed or occupied. He crossed into unoccupied France and eventually reached neutral Spain, then Portugal, then sailed back to the United States. He arrived in Washington in August 1940 and went directly to the White House. Roosevelt wanted a personal briefing, not a written report. Bullitt talked for 3 hours. He described the speed of the collapse, the psychological shock, the efficiency of German military operations, and most importantly, Britain's situation. Churchill was now leading a nation that had lost its only major ally, evacuated its army from France without its equipment, and faced invasion across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain was beginning. German bombers were hitting British cities. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered. Hitler was assembling invasion barges on the French coast. Roosevelt asked Bullitt the question that mattered: can Britain hold? Bullitt gave an answer that would influence American policy for the next year. If we help them, yes. If we don't, probably not. Churchill will never surrender, but that doesn't mean Britain can't be conquered. They need everything: ships, planes, weapons, supplies. They're alone against the entire German war machine. We're their only hope. Roosevelt was already working on exactly that. The Lend-Lease program was still months away from congressional approval, but Roosevelt was finding ways to send Britain military aid through legal loopholes and creative interpretations of neutrality law, destroyers for Bass's deals, arms sales, intelligence sharing, everything short of actually joining the war. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The detail that changes how we understand this entire period. Churchill knew something Bullitt didn't. Britain wasn't actually alone in August 1940, while Britain fought the Battle of Britain and faced potential invasion. Churchill authorized his intelligence services to begin Operation Ruthless, a plan to capture German Enigma code machines. British cryptographers at Bletchley Park were already reading some German communications, but they needed more machines, more codebooks, more information. Churchill bet Britain's survival on intelligence warfare, on knowing what Germany was planning before Germany acted. By September, the Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain. German invasion was postponed indefinitely. Hitler turned his attention east, toward the Soviet Union. Britain had survived the most dangerous moment by the thinnest possible margin. Bullitt watched this from Washington. No longer an ambassador, but now an advisor to Roosevelt on European affairs. He pushed for American intervention, arguing that Hitler would eventually turn on the United States after consolidating Europe. Roosevelt agreed, but faced massive public opposition. America wouldn't enter the war until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a year and a half after France fell. That year and a half was the hinge of history. If Britain had surrendered in summer 1940, if Churchill had accepted Hitler's peace offers, if the Battle of Britain had ended differently, there would have been no Allied base for invading Europe in 1944, no D-Day, no liberation of France, no defeat of Nazi Germany as we know it. The war would have ended with German domination of Europe and quite possibly a negotiated peace that left Hitler in power. France fell in 6 weeks because military doctrine failed to adapt to technological reality. French generals fought World War I, while Germany fought a mechanized war of mobility and speed. But France's fall also revealed something about Britain, about Churchill specifically. He was willing to gamble everything on the belief that America would eventually join the war, that the Soviet Union would eventually be attacked and become an ally, that somehow, impossibly, Britain could hold out long enough for the balance to shift. He was right, barely, but he was right. Bullitt spent the rest of his life haunted by those weeks in Paris. He wrote extensively about the collapse, gave speeches warning about totalitarian threats, and became an early voice in the Cold War, warning about Soviet expansion. He never stopped believing that democracies needed to prepare for war before war arrived, that waiting until the last moment guaranteed disaster. France had been the fourth strongest military power in the world in May 1940. By June, it had ceased to exist as an independent nation. Speed mattered. Preparation mattered. Will mattered. Churchill's words to Rannaud on that airfield in June 1940. His insistence that Britain would never surrender were both a promise and a plea. He was promising that Britain would fight alone if necessary. He was pleading for someone to believe it was possible. Bullitt believed it. Roosevelt believed it. Eventually, enough Americans believed it that when Pearl Harbor forced the issue, the United States entered the war with the understanding that Britain had bought the time needed to prepare. France fell in 6 weeks. Britain held for 5 years until victory. The difference wasn't military strength or industrial capacity. The difference was leadership willing to refuse surrender when surrender seemed rational. That's what Churchill said when France collapsed. Not just the famous speeches about fighting on beaches, the private words to Reynaud, "We cannot do this alone." An admission of vulnerability wrapped in a declaration of intent. Churchill knew Britain couldn't defeat Germany without help. He just refused to quit before that help arrived. It took 4 more years of war, 60 million dead, the Holocaust, atomic bombs, and the complete restructuring of global power. But Churchill's refusal to surrender in June 1940 made all of it possible. France's collapse in 6 weeks was the catastrophe that revealed both the fragility of democracy and the strength of determined resistance. William Bullitt returned to Paris in 1945 after liberation. The city had survived occupation, physically intact but psychologically scarred. He walked the same streets he'd watched German troops march down 5 years earlier. The swastika flags were gone. The Arc de Triomphe flew the French tricolour again. But France had lost something in those 6 weeks that had never fully recovered. The certainty that it could defend itself alone. Bullitt died in 1967, having witnessed France fall and rise again. He spent his last years writing about those weeks in 1940, trying to explain to new generations how quickly civilization could collapse when the will to defend it wavered. His cables to Roosevelt became historical documents. His eyewitness accounts of Churchill's visits to Paris became essential sources for understanding Britain's loneliest moment, the final irony. France fell so quickly that it shocked Germany almost as much as France itself. German generals had expected months of fighting, perhaps another year-long stalemate like World War I. When France collapsed in 6 weeks, Hitler was surprised. He stood at the Eiffel Tower, taking victory photographs before his own. Military planners had finished calculating occupation logistics. The speed of victory became a problem for Germany because it encouraged Hitler to believe nothing could stop him, that Britain would surrender next. Then the Soviet Union. That overconfidence contributed to every German strategic mistake that followed. France's collapse in 6 weeks was the disaster that saved the world by teaching everyone what was at stake. Churchill understood immediately. Roosevelt understood by August. The world understood by 1945. Democracy could die in weeks if people weren't willing to defend it regardless of the odds. That's the lesson Bullitt tried to preserve. That's what Churchill meant when he promised never to surrender. Not optimism, but refusal. Not certainty of victory, but certainty of resistance. France fell in 6 weeks because it stopped believing it could win. Britain survived 5 years because Churchill never stopped fighting. Sometimes, the most important thing a leader can say isn't a promise of victory. Sometimes it's a promise to keep fighting when victory seems impossible. Churchill said that to Reynaud on a French airfield in June 1940. He said it to his own people through 5 years of war. He said it to history, and history proved him right. The next time you think about World War II, remember that Britain's survival wasn't inevitable. It was a choice made by one man standing in the ruins of an alley's collapse, refusing to accept the rational conclusion. Sometimes defiance matters more than strength. Sometimes saying we will never surrender is the only weapon left. And sometimes, impossibly, it's enough.